That tree was there before the neighborhood even existed, before the sidewalk, before the asphalt, before the standardized white fences that now surround all the houses exactly 2.5 meters apart, as if they were made by a 3D printer powered by conformity. And before the blessed neighborhood association that seems to think that beauty is everything that doesn't carry history. The tree stood majestically in my front yard, a huge oak with branches so wide that they provided enough shade to cool the concrete in the middle of August. My grandfather planted that tree when he was still a boy, with his father's help. It was like a member of the family, the kind that doesn't talk, but knows everything. I looked after it with a kind of devotion that only those who understand the value of a long root can understand. But of course, anything outside the norm becomes a threat in this kind of community. And one day, like someone who spills poison in someone else's garden, a letter from the association appeared in my mailbox. It didn't even have a stamp. It was printed in Times New Roman font, signed in pen by a woman who introduced herself as the president of the HOA, with the same enthusiasm as someone who announces that she has become the head of something that nobody asked for. The claim, the tree was affecting the aesthetics of the neighborhood and posed structural risks to surrounding properties. I laughed when I read it, and then I was furious, not just because the tree was solid, healthy, and beautiful, but because the accusation came from someone who thought aesthetics was a plasticized lawn and bushes sculpted in the shape of a golf ball. The woman lived 3 houses down from me, a beige facade with fake columns and a fountain at the entrance that looked more like a stylized toilet, spitting water 24 hours a day. She passed by from time to time, walking with her nose held high as if she were parading on the red carpet of uselessness. And she always gave my tree that look like a graffiti artist in a museum. I knew it wasn't just about the tree, it was about control, about putting everyone in a straight line, with no curves, no shade, no memory. Cutting down the tree was, in her mind, the ultimate symbol of victory over deviation. I ignored the letter. No reply, no justification, no reaction. A week later, another letter, more direct, a final warning with the threat of a daily fine, claiming that I was violating Article 7, Section C of the Residential Landscaping Regulations. The name of the article alone seemed like a joke, as if the landscape had to follow an instruction manual. That's when I realized she was really willing to force me, and she wasn't going to stop until that tree fell. The next step was undoubtedly to bring in an HOA inspector with a clipboard and an anger meter, and maybe even a pruning crew, ready to turn my century-old oak into firewood for a luxury fireplace. But what she didn't know, and here's the kicker, was that I had better cards up my sleeve and deeper roots than she could have imagined. If she wanted to attack me with half-baked regulations, I was going to respond with history, with culture, with real laws. All I needed was a plan, and of course, strong coffee. Because when someone tries to tear away the only thing that connects you to the past, that's when you understand the power of standing still, like a tree. The next day, the tree was there, as firm and solid as ever, but I could already feel the pressure in the air, like a storm that hasn't arrived yet, but is already raising the hairs on my arm. It passed in front of my house again. She didn't say anything. She didn't even look at me. She just gave me that oblique look, like someone who makes a point of not acknowledging the other person's existence. A look that doesn't see you, but measures you. A kind of silent contempt that says more than any explicit offense. I got on with my life. I continued to look after the tree, watering around the root, cleaning the leaves that fell as the seasons changed, just like my grandfather used to do. But I knew it wouldn't be long before its next move came along. And that was that. On Tuesday, a guy who looked like a lost office worker showed up in my front yard. He was wearing a polo shirt with the association's logo on the chest, holding a clipboard, and looking at the tree like someone appraising a used car before making an offer. He asked if I was aware of the notice. I said yes. he asked if I had already arranged for the removal. I smiled. I asked him back if he knew the story of that tree. His silence was as short as the patience he pretended to have. He said he'd be back the following week, that if the tree wasn't cut down by then, I would start receiving a daily fine of $200. I asked if they intended to fine me per branch, or per fallen leaf as well. He didn't think it was funny. He went away saying something about compliance, security, and other terms that sound like they came out of the minutes of a meeting where nobody really lives. That's when I started my counterattack. I went downtown to the office where the historical and environmental records are kept. I calmly explained that there was a tree on my property that was over 150 years old, planted by a war veteran who was my great-grandfather. I showed them old photos, took records from older residents of the neighborhood who remembered the tree when they still used to ride around in wagons. Everything I could get my hands on. I put together a folder as if it were a war dossier. The sector employee looked at it all with a mixture of surprise and excitement. She said that few people took the trouble to preserve this kind of thing, and that, yes, it was possible to register the tree as local heritage. She handed me a form. It was a piece of paper that seemed more bureaucratic than an income tax form, but I filled it in with the pleasure of someone who knows they are signing peace with their ancestors. From there, I went straight to the mayor's office. Not that I had easy access, but, as luck would have it, a friend of mine from my youth worked there as an aide. I managed to arrange an informal meeting just to explain the situation. I took photos, the application paperwork, everything. And I was honest. I said it wasn't just for me, it was for the neighborhood, for the memory, for the absurdity of an association wanting to uproot a century-old tree just because someone thought it broke up the visual harmony of the street. He listened carefully. He laughed when I mentioned the aesthetics of the ball-shaped bushes. He said he'd see what he could do. He didn't promise anything, but the next day, I received an email saying that my request was being given priority by direct order of the mayor, and that, in the meantime, the tree would be under preliminary analysis for listing as one of the city's heritage trees. I went home lighthearted. The tree even looked taller that day, greener, as if it had felt that, at last, someone was fighting for it. On Saturday, a temporary plaque was installed by the town hall next to the trunk. In the process of historical recognition, it was small, discreet, but had an explosive effect. It didn't take long for the neighbors to start asking. Some complimented it. Others just shook their heads, as if it were the eccentricity of a stubborn old man. But the woman, oh, the woman. She showed up at the end of the day, dressed as if she was going to a trial. She stopped in front of my house, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the sign. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face, it was as if I had buried a forbidden totem right in the middle of her planned paradise. She didn't move for almost 2 minutes. Then she turned her back and walked away. And in that instant, I knew she wasn't going to give up. She was just stepping back to think about her next move. Because people like that can't bear to lose, especially when what's at stake isn't just a tree, but control. The idea that someone dared to say no. I just didn't know that her next move would be so dirty. On Monday morning, the letter carrier stopped in front of my house with the face of someone who already knew he was delivering a problem. It was a brown, heavy envelope, sealed with the pompous HOA logo in the corner, as if it were a royal decree. Inside was a 3-page letter and a formal notice that my decision to place the tree under review without prior authorization from the HOA constituted a serious violation of community guidelines. They were accusing me of circumventing the regulations by trying to protect my own tree. The irony was so absurd that I actually laughed out loud. What followed the laughter, however, was a bitter feeling that I was living in a theater of insanity where the rules change according to the ego of those in charge. The document said that the association would call an emergency meeting to discuss the Oak case. Yes, they wrote that, as if they were naming a police operation. I was invited, summoned, to attend and present formal explanations. On the appointed evening, I walked into the community center like someone entering a Kafkaesque courtroom. The room was full of white chairs lined up millimetrically, and half a dozen neighbors I'd never seen exchange a single good morning. The woman, of course, was sitting at the center of the main table, with a clipboard in front of her and a coffee cup that seemed to contain more arrogance than caffeine. She opened the meeting in a theatrically cordial voice, thanking everyone for coming. She said that the agenda was the unauthorized interference of a resident in the parameters of collective landscaping. He then began to read out a section of the regulations that talked about the need for prior approval for any structural changes to the facade of the houses. I interrupted, saying that a tree planted in 1871 by a Civil War veteran wasn't really a modification. She looked at me like I was biting her inside. When I was given the floor, I said what I needed to say, that the tree was part of the neighborhood's identity before the neighborhood even had a name, that my family had lived there for more than 4 generations, while the HOA had existed for just over 2 decades. That cutting down that tree would be like ripping out a piece of collective memory. There was silence. 1 or 2 neighbors coughed. No one seemed very convinced, but no one had the courage to interrupt me either. She then announced, with that sour pleasure of someone who thinks they're about to be checkmated, that she had already filed an application to revoke any attempt to have it listed, claiming that the tree posed a potential risk of falling and that its irregular positioning harmed the symmetry of the plot. That would have worried me if I hadn't gone deeper. What she didn't know was that, a few days earlier, I had hired a certified arborist to do a complete analysis of the tree's health. The report said in no uncertain terms that the oak was in excellent condition, with deep roots and no risk of falling. I handed a copy to each member present at the meeting, as if I were serving a burnt plate of reality. The woman pressed her lips together as if chewing glass. Still, she tried another stunt. She said that, regardless of the health of the tree, the mere fact that I had initiated legal proceedings with the city without the HOA's blessing constituted a breach of trust. That, she said, was reason enough to fine me retroactively for non-compliance with process. It was like being accused of not asking permission to breathe. The meeting ended in a ridiculous stalemate. She left the room with a stiff step and her head held high, as if she had still won. But I saw it. In her eyes, the spark of frustration, the anger of someone who planned everything, designed the perfect control, but was taken by surprise by someone who dared to go off script. That night, I sat on the veranda, under the tree, with a glass of whiskey and my dog sleeping at my feet. I looked up at the sky between the branches and felt something I hadn't felt for a long time: belonging. It wasn't just the house, or the street, or the tree. It was knowing that there was still room for resistance, for roots that don't bend. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning, when I opened the door, I saw that someone had dumped chemical fertilizer around the base of the tree, an absurd amount, with the clear aim of poisoning the soil. The smell was unmistakable. The earth, drenched in a strange sheen, looked sick. And that's when I realized she had crossed the line. When I saw that pile of fertilizer dumped at the base of the tree, my first reaction was a dry silence, the kind that comes before a hurricane. It wasn't just anger. It was a mixture of disbelief, sadness, and a nervous urge to laugh. Because there comes a point when the insanity of others surpasses any logic, and all that's left is to choose whether to explode or turn to stone. And at that moment, I chose to turn to stone. The earth was sick, and I knew it was no accident. Nobody dumps an industrial quantity of chemical fertilizer in the dark of night, in the exact place where a tree breathes, by mistake. That was sabotage. It was an attack. It was pure cowardice dressed up as zeal. And yet, if I went to the woman and demanded an explanation, she would do what these types of people always do: turn the tables, say it was concern for the soil, that she just wanted to help, that, maybe I should be more careful with the neighborhood's common area. But she didn't count on the fact that I was already expecting the blow. Maybe not in that way, but the poison would come sooner or later. So I had a plan B. I always had. I called the arborist again. He came back the same day, took soil samples and confirmed there was too much nitrate, toxic enough to kill any living root in a few weeks, if left untreated. Fortunately, we were able to act in time. We removed the contaminated layer, applied biological compost and stabilization nutrients. It was an expensive, time-consuming, and dirty process, but the tree held up. Of course it did. Meanwhile, the soil sample was sent to an environmental laboratory in the city, and as in every good story, where someone tries to cover up dirt with more dirt, the result came back faster than I expected. In addition to the fertilizer, they found residues of a herbicide banned for domestic use. The icing on the cake. That's when I went back to the town hall. But this time, I didn't just go with paperwork. I also took a lawyer. And believe me, it wasn't just any lawyer. It was the son of Becca, my next-door neighbor, the same woman who never attended an HOA meeting, but who saw that woman hanging around my tree 2 nights before the chemical attack. The lawyer loved the idea of turning it into a public case. He said that the association was about to discover the weight of playing with natural heritage under the process of being listed. The complaint was formalized. The city opened an environmental inquiry, and, as the tree was under historical protection, the attempted poisoning was treated as an environmental crime with aggravating factors. And to make matters worse for my president neighbor, the HOA was implicated as co-responsible. After all, it was she who had officially pushed for the tree's removal, and she was the one who led the meetings with threatening documents. And it was she, according to Becca, who was seen with a suspicious bag at midnight, leaning against my wall. The investigation caught fire. Neighbors started talking. Some even swore they heard footsteps and whispers on the night of the poisoning. Of course, no one wanted to commit themselves too much. These people like gossip, but not prosecution. Even so, the smoke was enough to generate heat. And the woman, who used to walk down the street like a condominium queen, began to avoid leaving the house. The ornamental fountain in her driveway was turned off. Her face of superiority turned into a mask of concern. When the city concluded its investigation, the tree was officially listed. It received the Municipal Natural Heritage Seal, and along with it, a golden plaque with its name, estimated planting date, and a brief description of its history. The mayor attended the symbolic ceremony. He took photos with me. He gave a short, direct speech, but with that air of civilized victory. And the best thing of all? The tree became part of the neighborhood's cultural itinerary, as a point of visit for schools and tourists. Yes, you read that right. Now, every Saturday, children from school buses get off in front of my house to hear the story of the oak. Guides talk about the value of preservation, about the history of the city's old families. Some parents take photos. Others just stare, pensive, as if realizing for the first time that important things don't have white frames or artificial grass. And the woman's house? Well, let's just say that it was curiously left off the new cultural map. The HOA was forced to change part of its statutes after the repercussions of the case. The president? Oh, she quietly resigned, citing health problems and personal strain. But everyone knows that she simply couldn't bear to see what had become a symbol of resistance right in front of her window. Today, every time I sit on the balcony, under the shade of the tree, I feel something that few rules and regulations can take away from someone. Peace with roots. The tree remains firm, growing, watching, surviving, just as it was taught to do. And whenever someone curious passes by asking why the plaque is there, I reply with a smile. Oh, that tree almost died because of a woman who hated everything she couldn't control. But look who's standing. And she listens. I know she does. Even with the windows closed. Because a tree doesn't shout. It just resists. And sometimes that hurts more than any shout. And if you like this video, leave your opinion in the comments and your like below.